Sarah Martinez wheeled herself through the courthouse doors, her military dress uniform crisp despite the wrinkles from sitting. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor as she navigated toward courtroom 3B. Her hands, steady from years of service, gripped the wheelchair's rims with quiet determination. The case was simple enough, a dispute with her former employer who had terminated her after she returned from deployment. What should have been a straightforward disability discrimination hearing had turned into something far more complex. Sarah's former boss claimed she was fired for performance issues, not because of her injury. The company's lawyers had painted her as someone seeking easy money, a narrative that stung worse than the shrapnel that had torn through her legs in Afghanistan. As she entered the courtroom, Sarah noticed the way conversations seemed to pause. Whispers followed her path down the aisle. She had grown accustomed to the stares, the assumption that her wheelchair defined her capabilities. What she hadn't expected was the barely concealed smirk on Judge Harrison's face as he reviewed her case file. "Another one of these cases," Judge Harrison muttered to his clerk, loud enough for the front row to hear. "These veterans think they're entitled to special treatment just because they wore a uniform." The jury box filled with 12 citizens who would decide her fate. Sarah studied their faces, noting the skeptical expressions, the way some avoided eye contact. Mrs. Thompson, in seat 4, shook her head slightly while reading the case. Summary. Mr. Rodriguez in seat 7 glanced at her wheelchair with what appeared to be pity, mixed with doubt. Sarah's lawyer, David Chen, had warned her this might happen. "Some people see the wheelchair first," he had said during their preparation. "They forget about the person inside." But Sarah had faced worse odds in Kandahar province. She had survived an IED blast that killed 2 of her squad members and left her paralyzed from the waist down. A skeptical jury seemed manageable by comparison. The opening statements began with the plaintiff's attorney painting Sarah as a dedicated employee who had given everything to her country and deserved basic accommodation upon her return. The defense countered by suggesting she was using her disability as an excuse for poor performance, that her military service, while admirable, didn't entitle her to keep a job she couldn't perform. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting he had already made up his mind. "Let's move this along," he said, tapping his pen impatiently. "I have a golf game at 3. The first witness took the stand, Sarah's former supervisor, Mark Stevens. He testified about missed deadlines, incomplete projects, and what he called attitude problems that emerged after her return from medical leave. His words painted a picture of someone who had lost her edge, who couldn't adapt to civilian life. "She just wasn't the same person who left for deployment," Stevens said, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "The military changes people, and not always for the better." Sarah watched the jury absorb every word. She saw Mrs. Thompson nod in agreement. Mr. Rodriguez took careful notes. The skepticism in their faces deepened with each accusation. They saw her uniform, her medals, but they were hearing a story of failure and excuse-making. During the lunch break, Sarah overheard 2 jurors talking in the hallway. "I support our troops," one said, "but this seems like she's looking for a handout." The other agreed, adding, "Just because you're in a wheelchair doesn't mean you can't do your job properly." The afternoon session brought character witnesses for the defense, co-workers who testified about Sarah's changed demeanor, her difficulty with tasks that had once been simple. Each testimony chipped away at her credibility, making her sound like someone grasping for excuses rather than seeking justice. Judge Harrison's impatience grew more obvious as the day progressed. He interrupted Sarah's lawyer repeatedly, sustained nearly every objection from the defense, and made comments that clearly showed his bias. "Can we speed this up?" he asked during one particularly detailed line of questioning. "This isn't a therapy session." The jury watched their judge's behavior and seemed to take cues from his dismissive attitude. Sarah could feel the room turning against her before she had even told her side of the story. The whispers during breaks grew louder, the stares more judgmental. As court adjourned for the day, Sarah remained in her seat while the room emptied. The janitor, an elderly man named Carlos, approached her quietly. "I was in Vietnam," he said softly. "I know that look. Don't let them break you." His words provided the only warmth Sarah had felt all day. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. "Ms. Martinez, how do you respond to allegations that you're exploiting your veteran status?" one called out. Sarah wheeled past without comment. her jaw set in determination. That evening, in her small apartment, Sarah sat at her kitchen table reviewing case files and legal documents. On the wall hung her Purple Heart bronze star and a photo of her unit before the bombing. 3 faces in that photo would never make it home. She had survived for a reason, and she wouldn't let a biased courtroom diminish the sacrifice she and her fellow soldiers had made. Her phone buzzed with messages from fellow veterans offering support. The story had begun circulating in military communities, and many recognized the pattern of discrimination Sarah faced. But social media was also filled with harsh comments from people who questioned her motives and suggested she was seeking undeserved compensation. Sarah knew tomorrow would bring more of the same. More skeptical looks, more dismissive comments from the judge, more testimony designed to paint her as a fraud. But she also knew something the courtroom didn't. Hidden in her lawyer's case file was evidence that would change everything. Documents that revealed the truth about her termination and her real identity within the military structure. As she prepared for bed, Sarah looked once more at the photo of her unit. Tomorrow, she whispered to the faces of her fallen comrades, they'll understand what service really means. The second day of trial began with more hostility than the first. Sarah arrived early, hoping to avoid the crowd of reporters who had gathered after news outlets picked up the story. The headline in the morning paper read, "Disabled Veteran Claims Discrimination in High-Profile Case." The article painted her in an unflattering light, suggesting she was part of a growing trend of veterans seeking compensation through the court system. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with visible annoyance, his black robes billowing as he took his seat. "Let's get this circus moving," he announced, barely glancing at the case file. "I want this wrapped up by Friday." His tone made it clear he considered the proceedings a waste of time. The jury filed in with expressions that had hardened overnight. Mrs. Thompson clutched her purse tightly and avoided looking at Sarah directly. Mr. Rodriguez wore a frown that suggested he had already reached his verdict. Sarah could feel the weight of their prejudgment settling over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Sarah's former company had brought in their star witness, Dr. Patricia Williams, a vocational rehabilitation specialist who had never met Sarah but had reviewed her case file. Dr. Williams took the stand with confidence, her gray hair pulled back severely and her glasses perched at the end of her nose. "Based on my review of the plaintiff's records," Dr. Williams testified, "I see clear evidence of someone unwilling to adapt to workplace modifications. Many disabled individuals successfully return to their previous employment with minimal accommodation. This case appears to be one where the individual chose not to put forth adequate effort." Sarah's lawyer objected to the speculation, but Judge Harrison overruled without consideration. "The witness is qualified to give her expert opinion," he stated dismissively. "Continue, Doctor." Dr. Williams proceeded to dissect Sarah's work performance with clinical detachment. She spoke about malingering behaviors and secondary gain motivations, psychological terms that made Sarah sound manipulative and dishonest. The jury absorbed every word, their skepticism growing with each professional-sounding accusation. "In my experience," Dr. Williams continued, "veterans sometimes struggle with the transition from military to civilian life. They may unconsciously seek the structure and attention that disability status provides. This can manifest as resistance to rehabilitation or return to full function." The testimony was devastating. Sarah watched as juror after juror nodded in agreement with the expert's assessment. Mrs. Thompson whispered something to the juror beside her, shaking her head sympathetically. But the sympathy wasn't for Sarah. It was for the company that had supposedly tried to help an ungrateful employee. During cross-examination, Sarah's lawyer, David Chen, attempted to challenge Dr. Williams's conclusions. "Doctor, you never actually met Ms. Martinez, correct?" "That's correct, but clinical records provide sufficient information for assessment." "And these clinical records, they don't include her complete military service record, do they?" Dr. Williams hesitated slightly. "I reviewed what was provided by the defense." "What was provided by the defense," Chen repeated slowly. "Did you request her complete military file?" "I wasn't given access to classified information, if that's what you're asking." Judge Harrison interrupted before Chen could pursue the line of questioning further. "Move along, counselor. We don't need a fishing expedition." The afternoon brought testimony from Sarah's former co-workers. One by one, They painted a picture of someone who had returned from deployment changed and difficult. They spoke about missed meetings, incomplete reports, and what they characterized as a hostile attitude toward feedback. Jennifer Walsh, who had worked in the cubicle next to Sarah's, testified about Sarah's supposed angry outbursts. She would get upset over small things, Walsh said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We all tried to be patient because of what she'd been through, but it became impossible to work with her. The testimony felt rehearsed, each witness hitting the same talking points about Sarah's supposed problems with authority and inability to handle stress. They portrayed her as someone living in the past, unable to move forward from her military experience. What they didn't mention was Sarah's perfect attendance record, her willingness to work overtime without complaint, or the commendations she had received from clients. Those documents existed, but the defense had successfully argued they were irrelevant to her performance after her injury. During a brief recess, Sarah overheard Judge Harrison talking to the court reporter. "These veteran cases are always the same," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "They think their service entitles them to special treatment. In my day, people took responsibility for their own problems." The court reporter, a middle-aged woman named Janet, glanced uncomfortably at Sarah but said nothing. The judge's bias was becoming impossible to ignore, yet Sarah's lawyer seemed powerless to address it effectively. When proceedings resumed, the defense called their final witness, a private investigator who had conducted surveillance on Sarah. The man, introduced as former police detective Robert Hayes, took the stand with a thick folder of photographs and video footage. "I observed the plaintiff on multiple occasions," Hayes testified, opening his folder with dramatic flair. "These images show her engaging in activities that contradict her claims of disability." The first photograph showed Sarah at a grocery store, reaching for items on a high shelf while seated in her wheelchair. The defense attorney presented it as evidence that she was more capable than she claimed. The second showed her transferring from her wheelchair to her car, a normal daily activity that the defense characterized as suspicious mobility. But the most damaging evidence was a video taken at a veterans gathering. The footage showed Sarah laughing with friends, appearing to enjoy herself at what the defense characterized as a party. They suggested that someone truly suffering from the trauma she claimed wouldn't be capable of such social interaction. The jury watched the surveillance footage with intense interest. Sarah could see them making mental notes, comparing what they saw on screen with the image of a struggling disabled veteran that her case presented. The defense was successfully reframing her normal activities as evidence of deception. Judge Harrison leaned forward during the surveillance testimony, showing more interest than he had all day. "These are quite revealing," he commented, studying the photographs. "Continue, Mr. Hayes." The investigator proceeded to describe his observations in detail, painting Sarah as someone who was clearly capable of more than she admits. He spoke about her driving, her shopping, her social interactions as if they were criminal activities rather than the normal life of a disabled person. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. The courtroom that should have been a place of justice had become a tribunal, where her every movement was scrutinized and her character assassinated. The jury's body language told the story. They had heard enough. In their minds, she was guilty of fraud, manipulation, and exploiting her veteran status for financial gain. As court adjourned for the day, Sarah noticed that even the bailiff looked at her differently. The whispers in the hallway were louder now, less concerned with hiding their judgment. "Did you see those photos?" someone said. "She's playing the system." Outside the courthouse, the crowd of reporters had grown. News vans lined the street and cameras tracked Sarah's movement to her modified vehicle. "Ms. Martinez," a reporter called out, "how do you respond to surveillance evidence that contradicts your disability claims?" Sarah's silence was interpreted as guilt by those watching. The evening news would feature the surveillance footage, the expert testimony, and Judge Harrison's obvious skepticism. Public opinion was turning against her with each passing hour. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah sat before her computer reading the online comments about her case. The hatred was overwhelming. People called her a fraud, a leech, a disgrace to the uniform. They suggested she was stealing from taxpayers and making it harder for real disabled veterans to get help. But buried among the cruel comments were messages from fellow veterans who recognized what was happening. They shared their own stories of discrimination, of being judged not by their service but by their disabilities. These voices reminded Sarah why she had to continue fighting, not just for herself, but for every veteran who would face this same prejudice. Tomorrow would bring her chance to testify, to tell her side of the story. But she knew the deck was stacked against her. The judge, the jury, and public opinion had already rendered their verdict. What they didn't know was that the truth about her service, and the real reason for her termination, was far more complex than anyone imagined. The third day brought Sarah's moment to speak, but the courtroom atmosphere had grown even more hostile. Overnight, social media had exploded with commentary about the case. Hashtags like "our fake veteran" and "disability fraud" were trending, accompanied by memes mocking Sarah's claims. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict before she could say a single word in her defense. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with what appeared to be a hangover and an even shorter temper than usual. His eyes were bloodshot, and he moved with the irritated shuffle of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, settling into his chair with obvious reluctance. The jury looked equally eager to conclude what they clearly viewed as a waste of time. Mrs. Thompson had brought a crossword puzzle book, barely concealing her boredom. Mr. Rodriguez checked his watch repeatedly, and several other jurors exchanged knowing glances that suggested they had already discussed their decision during breaks. When Sarah's lawyer called her to the witness stand, the movement of her wheelchair across the courtroom floor seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Every eye followed her progress, but not with sympathy or even curiosity. The stares carried judgment, skepticism, and barely concealed hostility. Sarah positioned herself beside the witness stand, her military posture intact despite sitting in a wheelchair. She had worn her dress uniform again, the medals catching the fluorescent courtroom lights, but what had once commanded respect now seemed to invite ridicule. She could see smirks on several faces, as if her uniform was nothing more than a costume in an elaborate performance. "Please state your name for the record," her lawyer began, following the formal protocol that seemed almost absurd given the atmosphere. "Sarah Elena Martinez, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, retired." Judge Harrison rolled his eyes at the formal military introduction. "We're not in the Army now, Ms. Martinez. This is a civilian court." The rebuke set the tone for everything that followed. David Chen began with basic questions about Sarah's background, her education, and her decision to join the military. But even these simple inquiries were met with skeptical looks from the jury. When Sarah mentioned graduating summa cum laude from her university, Mrs. Thompson actually snorted softly. "Tell us about your military service," Chen continued, trying to establish Sarah's credibility. Sarah began to describe her 8 years in the Army, her rapid promotions, and her deployment to Afghanistan, but Judge Harrison interrupted before she could provide any meaningful detail. "Move along, counselor. We don't need a complete military history. Get to the relevant facts." The judge's impatience prevented Sarah from explaining the nature of her service, the specialized training she had received, or the classified operations she had participated in. The jury heard only fragments: deployment to Afghanistan, an explosion, medical discharge. Without context, her service sounded routine, unremarkable. When Chen asked about the incident that led to her injuries, Sarah began to describe the convoy mission that changed her life. "We were providing security for a high-value transport when our vehicle hit an improvised explosive device." "High-value transport?" the defense attorney interrupted during cross-examination. "That sounds very dramatic, Ms. Martinez. Are you sure you're not embellishing for the jury's benefit?" The objection from Sarah's lawyer was overruled. Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. "Answer the question, Ms. Martinez. What exactly was this high-value transport?" Sarah hesitated. The details of that mission remained classified even years later. She couldn't explain that the convoy had been carrying captured intelligence assets, or that her unit had been part of a joint operation with special forces. The classification rules that protected national security now made her story sound vague and suspicious. "I can't provide specific details about the mission," Sarah said carefully. "Much of our work involved classified operations." This answer provoked visible annoyance from both the judge and jury. To them, her appeal to classified information sounded like a convenient excuse to avoid scrutiny. Mrs. Thompson shook her head dismissively, while Mr. Rodriguez made a note that looked distinctly skeptical. The defense attorney pounced on the apparent evasion. How convenient, Ms. Martinez. Every time we ask for details about your supposed heroic service, you claim it's classified. Are we supposed to just take your word for it? Sarah felt trapped. The very secrecy that had protected her fellow soldiers and ongoing operations now made her appear deceptive. She couldn't explain that she had been part of an elite intelligence gathering unit, or that her injury had occurred during a mission to capture a high-ranking enemy operative. Judge Harrison's patience, already thin, evaporated completely. Ms. Martinez, this is a court of law, not a movie theater. If you can't provide factual testimony about your service, perhaps we should move on to matters you can discuss honestly. The accusation of dishonesty hit Sarah like a physical blow. Around the courtroom, she could see people nodding in agreement with the judge's assessment. The classified nature of her service, which should have indicated the importance of her role, was being used to paint her as a liar. Chen tried to redirect the testimony toward Sarah's work performance before her deployment. She had been an exemplary employee, consistently rated as exceeding expectations with several commendations from supervisors and clients, but the defense attorney systematically dismantled each positive evaluation. These performance reviews, the defense attorney said, waving the documents dismissively. They're all from before your injury, aren't they, Ms. Martinez? And isn't it true that military service can change people in ways that don't show up until they return to civilian life? The question was loaded with implications about PTSD, mental instability, and the supposed problems that military service created for veterans. Sarah tried to explain that her injury was physical, not psychological, but the damage was done. The jury had been given permission to view her military service as a liability rather than an asset. When Chen asked about her termination, Sarah described returning to work with enthusiasm, eager to resume her career. She had worked with human resources to arrange necessary accommodations, a height-adjustable desk, accessible parking, modified bathroom facilities. The company had initially seemed supportive. But things changed after a few weeks. Sarah testified. My supervisor began criticizing my work unfairly. Projects I completed successfully were found fault with. Meetings were scheduled in inaccessible locations despite requests for accommodation. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. Ms. Martinez, isn't it possible that your work really did decline after your injury? That you were simply unable to perform at your previous level? No, that's not true. I was performing the same job functions as before my deployment. But you were different after your injury, weren't you? Angry, perhaps? Resentful about your situation? Sarah tried to explain that any frustration she felt was about workplace discrimination, not her disability. But the attorney twisted every answer, making her sound bitter and difficult to work with. Judge Harrison seemed to enjoy the aggressive cross-examination. He sustained every objection from the defense while overruling most of Sarah's attorney's attempts to protect her. The witness can handle a few tough questions, he said with obvious satisfaction. The testimony that should have been Sarah's opportunity to tell her story became an ordeal of humiliation. Every aspect of her service was questioned, every claim was challenged, and every attempt to maintain dignity was met with skepticism. The jury watched her struggle with expressions that ranged from boredom to outright hostility. During a break, Sarah overheard two jurors talking in the hallway. She's obviously hiding something, one said. All this classified nonsense. Who does she think she's fooling? The other agreed, adding, My cousin is a veteran and he doesn't act like this. She's just looking for a payday. When court resumed, the defense attorney delivered what felt like a final blow. Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that you were actually relieved when you were terminated? That you saw it as an opportunity to file this lawsuit and collect damages without having to work? The question was so outrageous that Sarah's anger finally showed. That's absolutely false. I love my job and wanted to continue my career. But a lawsuit is much easier than working, isn't it? Especially when you can play the victim card? Chen's objection was sustained, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Sarah's anger, and in the context of all the negative testimony, it appeared to confirm the defense's portrayal of her as bitter and manipulative. As the day ended, Sarah felt completely defeated. Her chance to tell her truth had been turned into a showcase for everything wrong with her character. The classified nature of her real service made her sound evasive, her disability made her seem weak, and her pursuit of justice made her appear greedy. That evening, The news coverage was devastating. Video clips showed her angry response to the defense attorney's accusations, making her look unstable and hostile. Social media erupted with even more vicious commentary. People who had never served in the military, never faced discrimination, never been injured in service to their country, felt qualified to judge her credibility and motives. The fourth day began with closing arguments, and the courtroom was packed with spectators who had come to witness what many expected to be Sarah's final humiliation. News crews lined the hallway, and protesters had gathered outside with signs reading "Stop, Disability Fraud," and "Veterans Don't Deserve Special Treatment." The hostile atmosphere had reached a fever pitch. Judge Harrison entered, with what appeared to be satisfaction at the media attention. He had granted several interviews the previous evening, making comments about frivolous lawsuits and people who abuse the system. His bias was no longer hidden. It was being celebrated by those who agreed with his perspective. The defense attorney began his closing argument with confidence, knowing he was speaking to a receptive audience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, gesturing toward Sarah with barely concealed contempt, "you have witnessed 3 days of testimony that reveals the truth about this case. Ms. Martinez is not the victim she claims to be. She is a manipulator who has wrapped herself in the flag to hide her deception." The lawyer systematically dismantled every aspect of Sarah's case. He reminded the jury of the surveillance footage, the expert testimony about malingering, and what he characterized as her evasive answers about her military service. She asks you to take her word about classified missions and secret operations. She wants you to believe in fairy tales while ignoring the evidence of your own eyes. Mrs. Thompson nodded vigorously throughout the presentation. Mr. Rodriguez took careful notes, underlining what appeared to be key points that supported the defense's argument. Several other jurors exchanged glances that clearly indicated they had already reached their decision. The defense attorney saved his most damaging argument for last. "Ms. Martinez doesn't represent the brave veterans who have truly sacrificed for our country. She represents the worst instincts of a society that rewards victimhood over personal responsibility. She is an insult to every disabled person who works hard to overcome their challenges without seeking handouts." The argument was devastating because it turned Sarah's disability and veteran status into weapons against her. The lawyer had successfully reframed her pursuit of justice as an attack on legitimate disabled people and honorable veterans. The jury looked at her with expressions of disgust, as if she had personally betrayed every principle they held dear. Judge Harrison's reaction to the closing argument was telling. He leaned back in his chair with obvious approval, occasionally nodding at particularly effective points. When the defense attorney finished, the judge actually smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure he had shown during the entire trial. Sarah's lawyer, David Chen, faced an impossible task. The courtroom atmosphere was so hostile that any defense seemed futile, but he stood and began his closing argument with quiet dignity, hoping to reach whatever humanity remained in the jury. "Ms. Martinez served her country with honor," Chen began, but he was immediately interrupted by snickers from the gallery. Judge Harrison made no effort to maintain order, allowing the disruption to underscore the lack of respect for Sarah's service. Chen tried to focus on the facts of the discrimination case, the accessible parking that was eliminated, the meeting scheduled in inaccessible locations, the performance evaluations that suddenly became negative after her return. But the jury had been conditioned to see these as complaints from someone seeking excuses rather than evidence of systematic discrimination. "The law requires employers to provide reasonable accommodation," Chen continued. "It doesn't require disabled employees to be grateful for discrimination or to accept second-class treatment because of their service to this country." But his words fell on deaf ears. The jury had heard 3 days of testimony portraying Sarah as manipulative, dishonest, and greedy. Chen's appeal to legal principles seemed abstract and irrelevant compared to the emotional narrative the defense had created. When Chen mentioned Sarah's classified military service, trying to suggest that there was more to her story than they had heard, Judge Harrison interrupted with obvious irritation. "Counselor, we've heard enough about these supposed classified operations. If Ms. Martinez can't provide evidence of her claims, the jury should disregard them entirely." The judge's instruction effectively eliminated any consideration of Sarah's real military service. The jury was being told to ignore the very facts that would have changed their understanding of the case. Chen tried to object, but Harrison's mind was made up. During the lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the courthouse cafeteria, while groups of people discussed her case at nearby tables. The conversations were loud enough for her to hear, and the comments were uniformly negative. "She's obviously lying," one person said. "My brother-in-law is a real veteran, and he would never act like this." The afternoon brought jury instructions from Judge Harrison, but his presentation was heavily biased toward the defense. He emphasized the burden of proof on Sarah, while minimizing the legal requirements for accommodation. His instructions suggested that the jury should be skeptical of disability claims and should not award damages without clear and convincing evidence carried a higher standard than the law actually required. "You must not let sympathy cloud your judgment," Harrison instructed the jury. "The fact that someone claims to be a veteran or claims to be disabled does not entitle them to financial compensation unless they can prove their case with facts, not emotions or appeals to patriotism." The instructions were a roadmap for finding against Sarah. The judge had essentially told the jury that, considering her military service or disability, status would be inappropriate, eliminating the very factors that were central to her discrimination claim. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, their body language suggested the discussion would be brief. Mrs. Thompson was already shaking her head, and Mr. Rodriguez had put away his notepad as if the case was already decided. Several jurors avoided looking at Sarah entirely, as if they couldn't bear to face someone they were about to condemn. The media coverage during the jury deliberation was vicious. Cable news programs featured panels of experts discussing what they called the Martinez case syndrome, veterans who allegedly exploited their service for financial gain. Social media hashtags trending against Sarah reached millions of users, with memes and videos mocking her testimony. Conservative commentators praised Judge Harrison's handling of the case, calling him a hero for standing up to lawsuit abuse. Liberal commentators, who might have been expected to support a disabled veteran, were strangely silent, perhaps afraid of being seen as defending someone the public had already convicted in the court of opinion. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The speed of their decision spoke volumes about how seriously they had considered the evidence. Mrs. Thompson had been elected forewoman, and she stood to deliver the verdict with obvious satisfaction. "In the case of Martinez versus Blackstone Industries, we find for the defendant on all counts," she announced. "We find that the plaintiff has failed to prove discrimination and is not entitled to any damages." The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Harrison made no effort to maintain order, allowing the celebration to continue for several minutes. Sarah sat motionless in her wheelchair, absorbing the reality that 12 citizens had unanimously rejected her claim for justice, but the verdict was just the beginning of her humiliation. Mrs. Thompson continued reading from a prepared statement that went far beyond the simple legal finding. "Furthermore, the jury wishes to express our disgust with the plaintiff's attempt to exploit her veteran status for financial gain. We believe this case represents an abuse of our legal system and an insult to legitimate disabled individuals and honorable veterans." The statement was unprecedented. Juries typically rendered simple verdicts, not moral judgments, but Judge Harrison allowed the condemnation to continue, clearly enjoying the public rebuke of Sarah's character. As the jury filed out, several members looked at Sarah with expressions of contempt. They had not just rejected her legal claim, they had rejected her humanity, her service, and her right to seek justice when wronged. The media frenzy that followed was intense. Reporters surrounded Sarah as she left the courthouse, shouting questions about her reaction to the verdict and whether she regretted filing the lawsuit. Protesters cheered as she passed, celebrating what they saw as justice served against a fraud. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reading the news coverage of her defeat. Headlines across the country proclaimed, "Jury rejects veterans' fraud. Claims in disabled woman's lawsuit backfires." Spectacularly, the stories portrayed her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of false accusations and frivolous litigation. But, in the depths of her defeat, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She opened the file folder her lawyer had advised her to save for emergencies. Inside were documents that would expose the truth about her service, her termination, and the powerful people who had orchestrated her destruction. The classified records revealed that Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez had not been an ordinary soldier. She had been part of an elite intelligence unit that had uncovered a massive corruption scheme involving defense contractors and military officials. Her injury had occurred during a mission to gather evidence that would expose billions of dollars in fraud and potentially save thousands of military lives. Her termination from Blackstone Industries was not about her disability. It was about her knowledge of their illegal activities and their fear that she would expose them. The surveillance, the character assassination, the biased trial, all of it had been orchestrated to discredit her before she could reveal what she knew. As Sarah prepared to make the most difficult decision of her life, she looked once more at the photo of her fallen comrades. Tomorrow, she would risk everything to honor their memory and expose the truth. The judge and jury who had mocked her would learn that they had not defeated a fraud, they had participated in the persecution of a true American hero. Sarah spent the night, after her verdict, making the most difficult decision of her military career. The classified documents spread across her kitchen table contained information that could destroy her enemies, but releasing them would violate every oath she had taken as a soldier. The weight of her fallen comrade's sacrifice pressed down on her as she considered the consequences of exposing the truth. At dawn, she made a secure phone call to her former commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, who was now stationed at the Pentagon. The conversation was brief but crucial. Morrison confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Her case had been monitored at the highest levels of government, and powerful people wanted her discredited and silenced. "Sarah, what happened to you in that courtroom was orchestrated," Morrison said quietly. "Blackstone Industries has connections that reach into Congress, the Defense Department, and the judiciary. They knew you could expose their fraud, so they destroyed your credibility first." The revelation that her persecution had been planned made Sarah's decision easier. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every soldier whose life had been put at risk by the corruption she had discovered. The judge and jury who had mocked her had unknowingly participated in a conspiracy to protect war profiteers. That morning, Sarah contacted every major news organization in the country. Most reporters hung up when she mentioned her name, having already written her off as a discredited fraud. But one investigative journalist, Maria Santos from the Washington Herald, agreed to meet with her privately. Santos arrived at Sarah's apartment that afternoon with obvious skepticism. She had covered the trial and written articles questioning Sarah's credibility. But when Sarah began laying out the classified documents, Santos's expression changed from doubt to shock to growing excitement. The documents revealed a massive conspiracy involving Blackstone Industries and several other defense contractors. They had been selling defective equipment to the military while bribing officials to overlook safety violations. The armor plating that was supposed to protect soldiers was substandard. The communication systems failed in combat, and the medical supplies were often expired or contaminated. "My unit discovered this during our deployment," Sarah explained, pointing to intelligence reports and photographs. "We found warehouses full of rejected equipment being shipped to forward operating bases. We documented serial numbers, photographed the evidence, and identified the officials involved in the cover-up." Santos studied the documents with growing amazement. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Billions of dollars in contracts, thousands of soldiers put at risk, and a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of government and military leadership. "This is why they targeted you," Santos realized. "Your lawsuit wasn't about disability discrimination. It was about silencing a witness to war crimes." The next piece of evidence was even more damning. Sarah produced recordings she had made during her employment at Blackstone Industries. Conversations where executives discussed bribing military officials and covering up equipment failures. The recordings revealed callous disregard for soldier safety and celebration of profits earned through fraud. In one particularly damning recording, Sarah's former supervisor could be heard saying, "If a few soldiers die because of our equipment, that's the cost of doing business. As long as we keep the contracts coming, we'll make billions." Santos spent hours reviewing the evidence, cross-referencing documents with known defense contracts and verifying the authenticity of the recordings. Everything checked out. Sarah Martinez wasn't a fraud, she was a whistleblower whose life had been destroyed to protect war profiteers. Why didn't you release this during the trial? Santos asked. Sarah's answer revealed the impossible position she had been placed in. These documents are classified at the highest levels. Releasing them without authorization would have sent me to federal prison for espionage. I tried to work within the system, filing complaints with the Inspector General and requesting permission to testify. But every official I contacted either ignored me or told me to stay quiet for national security reasons. The system that was supposed to protect whistleblowers had instead been used to silence them. Sarah had been trapped between her oath as a soldier and her duty as a citizen, unable to expose the truth without destroying herself. Santos realized the full scope of what had happened in that courtroom. The judge, the jury, the defense attorneys, they were all manipulated. Public opinion was turned against you so that if you ever tried to tell the truth, no one would believe you. The strategy had been brilliant in its cruelty. By destroying Sarah's credibility first, the conspirators had made it nearly impossible for her to expose their crimes later. Who would believe a woman who had been publicly labeled a fraud and a manipulator? But Santos saw the story's potential to change everything. If we publish this, it will vindicate you completely. Everyone who mocked you, everyone who called you a fraud will have to face the truth about what they did. Sarah nodded, but her expression remained grim. It will also expose me to criminal prosecution for releasing classified information. And it will put other soldiers at risk if the investigation compromises ongoing operations. The weight of the decision was enormous. Exposing the truth would clear Sarah's name, but might destroy her life in other ways. The same government that had allowed her persecution might prosecute her for revealing the crimes she had discovered. That evening, as Santos prepared her story for publication, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A black sedan had been parked outside her apartment building all day, and now a man in an expensive suit knocked on her door. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Director Williams from the Defense Intelligence Agency," he said, showing official credentials. "I need to speak with you about some documents that have come to our attention." Sarah knew this moment would come. The intelligence community had been monitoring her activities, waiting to see if she would break her silence. Williams entered her apartment and immediately noticed the classified documents still spread across her table. "You're taking a very dangerous path," Williams said quietly. "These documents contain information that could compromise ongoing operations and put lives at risk. We strongly advise you to reconsider any plans to make them public." But Sarah had made her choice. "Director Williams, these documents also contain evidence of crimes that have already put thousands of lives at risk. The soldiers dying because of defective equipment deserve justice more than the criminals deserve protection." Williams studied her for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something in her determination that reminded him of his own military service. Finally, he made a decision that would change everything. "Ms. Martinez, what if I told you there was another way? A way to expose this corruption without compromising national security or destroying your life?" Sarah looked up with cautious hope. For the first time since her ordeal began, someone in authority was offering help instead of threats. The next day would bring revelations that would shock the nation and vindicate everything she had endured. The judge and jury, who had mocked her service, were about to learn that they had persecuted one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in modern military history. The woman they had called a fraud was actually a hero whose courage had saved countless lives and whose silence had protected national security, even at the cost of her own reputation. But Sarah's story was far from over. The truth about her service was only the beginning of revelations that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of government and transform her from a discredited veteran into a symbol of courage and integrity. The next morning brought a carefully orchestrated revelation that would change everything. Director Williams had worked through the night with congressional allies and Department of Justice officials to declassify key portions of Sarah's military record. What emerged was a story that transformed her from a discredited fraud into one of the most decorated intelligence operatives of her generation. The Washington Herald's front page headline read, "War Hero Persecuted Decorated. Intelligence Officer Silenced for Exposing Defense. Fraud." Maria Santos's article revealed that Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and multiple intelligence commendations, all classified until now. The article detailed Sarah's real military service. She had not been an ordinary soldier, but a member of the elite military intelligence special operations unit. Her team had conducted high-risk missions behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks and saved thousands of civilian lives. The mission where Sarah was injured had not been routine convoy security. She had been leading a dangerous operation to capture a high-value target who was coordinating attacks on American forces. The intelligence her team gathered during that mission had led to the disruption of an entire terrorist network. But the most shocking revelation was about the explosion that had ended her career. Sarah's vehicle had hit an IED, but investigation revealed that the blast should not have been fatal. The armor plating on her vehicle, manufactured by Blackstone Industries, had failed catastrophically. Equipment that should have protected her had instead amplified the explosion's effects. Sergeant Martinez's injuries were a direct result of the defective equipment she was investigating. The article revealed she became a victim of the very fraud she had discovered. The irony was devastating. Sarah had been wounded by the corruption she was trying to expose, then persecuted by the same system when she sought justice. The defense contractors hadn't just stolen money. They had blood on their hands. Within hours of the article's publication, the news exploded across every media platform. Cable news networks scrambled to contact military experts who could explain the significance of Sarah's declassified service record. Veterans organizations released statements demanding investigations into her treatment. Judge Harrison's office was flooded with calls from reporters seeking comment on his handling of the case. The man who had mocked Sarah's service record was now facing questions about whether he had been part of a conspiracy to silence a war hero. His past financial connections to defense contractors suddenly came under scrutiny. The jury members who had condemned Sarah began receiving calls from journalists asking about their verdict. Mrs. Thompson, who had been so confident in her judgment, now faced the reality that she had participated in the persecution of someone who had risked her life for her country. "I had no idea," Thompson told a reporter, her voice shaking. "If we had known the truth about her service, everything would have been different. We were told she was lying about classified missions. How were we supposed to know they were real?" The defense attorney who had so viciously attacked Sarah's credibility suddenly found himself under investigation by the State Bar Association. Questions arose about whether he had known the truth about his client's criminal activities and had deliberately participated in silencing a whistleblower. But the revelations were just beginning. Director Williams had authorized the release of additional classified information that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy against Sarah. Blackstone Industries had indeed orchestrated her persecution, working with corrupt officials to ensure she could never expose their fraud. The company had hired private investigators to conduct surveillance not just on Sarah, but on her family members, friends, and former military colleagues. They had accessed her medical records illegally, planted false stories in the media, and even influenced the jury selection process to ensure she would face the most hostile panel possible. Most shocking of all was the revelation that Judge Harrison had received substantial campaign contributions from organizations linked to Blackstone Industries. His obvious bias during the trial wasn't just personal prejudice, it was corruption in action. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Protests that had once called Sarah a fraud now demanded justice for her persecution. Veterans who had criticized her on social media issued public apologies. The hashtags that had once mocked her now expressed support and outrage at her treatment. Social media exploded with messages from people who felt ashamed of their rush to judgment. "We failed a hero" became a trending topic as millions of Americans grappled with their participation in Sarah's persecution. The same platforms that had spread hatred now carried messages of support and demands for accountability. But perhaps the most powerful response came from Sarah's fellow veterans. Military personnel from across the country began sharing their own stories of persecution and discrimination. Sarah's case had opened floodgates of revelations about how the system failed those who served. General Patricia Hayes, the Army's highest-ranking female officer, released a statement that sent shockwaves through the military establishment. "Sergeant Martinez represents the finest tradition of American military service. Her treatment by our civilian institutions is a disgrace that demands immediate correction and accountability." So, statement from such a high-ranking officer signaled that Sarah's vindication had support at the highest levels of military leadership. The same establishment that had once remained silent was now rallying to her defense. Congressional hearings were announced within days. The House Armed Services Committee and Senate Judiciary Committee both launched investigations into defense contractor fraud, judicial corruption, and the persecution of military whistleblowers. Sarah would be the star witness in hearings that would expose decades of systemic corruption. Blackstone Industries' stock price collapsed as investors fled the company. Federal agents raided their headquarters, seizing documents and arresting executives. The fraud that Sarah had risked everything to expose was finally being investigated with the full power of the federal government, but the personal cost to those who had participated in Sarah's persecution was also becoming clear. Judge Harrison announced his retirement, facing possible impeachment proceedings. Several jury members required counseling as they grappled with their role in persecuting a hero. The defense attorney lost his law license pending investigation into his conduct. The private investigators who had conducted surveillance on Sarah were arrested on federal charges. The media personalities who had mocked her faced boycotts and sponsor withdrawals. Sarah herself became an overnight symbol of courage and perseverance. Speaking requests poured in from universities, veterans organizations, and civil rights groups. Publishers offered seven-figure book deals. Hollywood producers competed for the rights to her story. But Sarah remained focused on the mission that had driven her throughout her ordeal. In her first public statement since her vindication, she said simply, "This was never about me. This was about protecting the soldiers who depend on reliable equipment and honest leadership. Justice for me means nothing if we don't fix the system that allowed this corruption to flourish." The woman who had been mocked and humiliated in a biased courtroom had emerged as one of the most respected voices in American public life. Her vindication was complete, but her work was just beginning. The next phase of her journey would transform her from a victim of injustice into a powerful force for reform and accountability. Tomorrow would bring her appearance before Congress, where she would finally tell her complete story to a nation that was ready to listen. The judge and jury who had once mocked her would watch on television as she was honored as a hero by the same government they had thought she was defrauding. 6 months after her vindication, Sarah Martinez sat in the witness chair before a packed congressional hearing room. But this time the atmosphere could not have been more different. The same marble corridors that had once echoed with mockery now buzzed with respectful admiration. Camera crews from around the world had gathered to document what many were calling the most important military fraud hearing in decades. Committee Chairman Senator Robert Chen opened the hearing with words that would have seemed impossible during Sarah's trial. "We are honored today to hear testimony from Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, whose courage in exposing defense contractor fraud has potentially saved thousands of American lives. Her treatment by our judicial system represents a failure of justice that this committee is determined to address." Sarah wore her dress uniform, but now the medals visible on her chest told a complete story. The previously classified commendations had been joined by new honors, including the Congressional Gold Medal for her whistleblowing efforts. The woman who had once been called a fraud was now recognized as one of the most decorated veterans of her generation. The hearing room was filled with supporters, fellow veterans, military families, and citizens who had learned the truth about her persecution. In the front row sat Colonel Morrison, her former commanding officer, and Maria Santos, the journalist whose investigation had sparked Sarah's vindication. Even some of the jurors from her original trial had come to witness her testimony. Mrs. Thompson, the jury forewoman who had once delivered the verdict against Sarah with satisfaction, now sat in the gallery with tears in her eyes. She had become one of the most vocal advocates for judicial reform, speaking publicly about how easily she and her fellow jurors had been manipulated by incomplete information and bias. Sarah's testimony began with a complete account of her military service, no longer constrained by classification restrictions. She described operations that had disrupted terrorist networks, intelligence gathering that had prevented attacks on American soil, and the brotherhood she had shared with soldiers who had given their lives for their country. The mission where I was injured was investigating reports that American soldiers were dying because of defective equipment, Sarah testified, her voice clear and strong. We discovered that Blackstone Industries and other contractors were knowingly shipping substandard gear to combat zones while bribing officials to ignore safety violations. She detailed the scope of the fraud with devastating precision, armor plating that cracked under pressure, communication equipment that failed during firefights, medical supplies that were expired or contaminated. The contractors had prioritized profits over the lives of the soldiers they were supposed to protect. My team documented serial numbers of rejected equipment that was being shipped anyway. We photographed warehouses full of gear that had failed safety tests. We recorded conversations with contractors who knew their products were defective but continued selling them to the military. The hearing room was silent except for the sound of furious note-taking as Sarah laid out evidence that would lead to dozens of criminal indictments. But the most powerful part of her testimony came when she spoke about the personal cost of seeking justice. When I returned home injured, I thought the hardest part of my service was over, Sarah said, her composure never wavering. I was wrong. The hardest part was being called a fraud and a liar when I tried to expose the truth. The hardest part was watching my fellow citizens celebrate my persecution without knowing that I had risked my life to protect them. Senator Maria Rodriguez, who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's case, now leaned forward with obvious emotion. Sergeant Martinez, on behalf of this committee and the American people, I want to apologize for the treatment you received. Your persecution represents a failure of our institutions that we are committed to ensuring never happens again. The apology was echoed by members of both parties, a rare moment of bipartisan unity in recognizing that Sarah's treatment had been a national disgrace. But Sarah's response showed the grace that had sustained her through her darkest moments. Senator, I don't seek apologies for myself, she said. I seek accountability for the system that allowed corruption to flourish and whistleblowers to be silenced. My experience was painful, but it revealed problems that affect every American who depends on honest government and military integrity. The committee then heard testimony about the broader impact of Sarah's revelations. Defense Department officials testified that her intelligence had led to the recall of thousands of pieces of defective equipment and the cancellation of billions of dollars in fraudulent contracts. Military medical officers testified that improved equipment standards resulting from her whistleblowing had already saved hundreds of lives. General Patricia Hayes, now retired, delivered testimony that brought the room to its feet. Sergeant Martinez embodies everything we hope to see in an American soldier: courage, integrity, and devotion to duty that transcends personal cost. Her treatment by our civilian institutions was not just wrong, it was dangerous to national security. When we silence whistleblowers, we enable the very corruption that puts our troops at risk. The hearing also addressed the systematic failures that had enabled Sarah's persecution. FBI Director Thomas Walker testified about the investigation into Blackstone Industries, which had revealed a network of corruption involving defense contractors, military officials, and even members of the judiciary. The conspiracy to silence Sergeant Martinez was extensive and sophisticated, Walker testified. Private investigators, media manipulation, judicial corruption, and intimidation tactics were all employed to discredit her before she could expose the truth. This represents one of the most serious attacks on whistleblower protection in our nation's history. Judge Harrison himself was called to testify, appearing under subpoena and facing questions about his conduct during Sarah's trial. The man who had once mocked her service now sat nervously as senators grilled him about his financial connections to defense contractors and his obvious bias during the proceedings. Your Honor, Senator Chen said with barely concealed disgust, you presided over the persecution of a decorated war hero while receiving campaign contributions from the very companies she was trying to expose. How do you explain this conflict of interest? Harrison's responses were weak and evasive, a stark contrast to his confident arrogance during Sarah's trial. He claimed ignorance of his donor's criminal activities and insisted his bias was based on legal principles rather than corruption. Few believed him. The defense attorney who had so viciously attacked Sarah's credibility was also called to testify, now facing disbarment and possible criminal charges. His aggressive tactics during the trial were revealed to have been coordinated with Blackstone Industries, turning the courtroom into a venue for corporate intimidation rather than justice. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when the committee heard from other veterans who had faced similar persecution for exposing fraud and corruption. Sarah's case had opened floodgates of revelations about systematic retaliation against military whistleblowers. Captain Michael. Torres testified about being court-martialed for exposing sexual assault cover-ups. Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Wang described career destruction for reporting procurement fraud. Major David Kim detailed threats against his family for documenting war crimes. Sarah's courage in speaking out had inspired others to break their silence. The hearing concluded with Sarah's final statement, words that would be quoted in history books and remembered as a defining moment in the fight for government accountability. I took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Corruption that puts soldiers' lives at risk is a domestic enemy, as dangerous as any foreign threat. My persecution was painful, but it revealed the cancer of corruption that threatens our military and our democracy. If my suffering helps protect future whistleblowers and saves even one soldier's life, then it was worth every moment of humiliation I endured. The committee room erupted in sustained applause as Sarah finished her testimony. Senators from both parties stood to honor her courage, and the gallery joined in recognition of a true American hero. In the months that followed, Sarah's testimony would lead to the largest defense contractor fraud prosecution in American history. Dozens of executives were sentenced to prison, billions in fraudulent contracts were canceled, and new protections for military whistleblowers were enacted into law. Judge Harrison was impeached and removed from office, becoming the first federal judge in decades to face such consequences for judicial misconduct. The defense attorney was disbarred and faced federal charges for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Sarah herself became a powerful advocate for government reform and military accountability. She established a foundation to support military whistleblowers and their families, ensuring that others would not face the persecution she had endured alone. The woman who had been mocked as a fraud in a biased courtroom had become one of the most respected voices in American public life. Her story became a powerful reminder that courage and integrity could triumph over corruption and prejudice, even when the odds seemed impossible. Most importantly, Sarah's vindication led to real change that saved lives. The improved equipment standards resulting from her whistleblowing protected soldiers in combat zones around the world. The enhanced protections for whistleblowers encouraged others to speak out against fraud and corruption. Years later, when military historians wrote about the fight against defense contractor fraud, they would mark Sarah Martinez's testimony as the turning point when America chose accountability over corruption, truth over convenience, and justice over prejudice. The judge and jury who had once mocked her had unknowingly participated in a moment that would define the character of their nation, and Sarah's grace and triumph showed them what true heroism looked like.